Thin lines and tiny elements is a frequent fault of branding design that relates to both imagery and to typography. Let's talk about it. We have already dealt with the problem of overall mass. A similar but distinct issue is that of tiny elements or thin lines, even when found in a logo that has sufficient overall mass. In every kind of printing, be it offset, letterpress, laser, or inkjet, there is a similar drawback. In relation to halftone images, it is called dot gain. It causes fine reversed lines to fill in. I call it ink creep. The ink from the bigger object usually fills in the fine negative lines to some degree. If the lines are substantial enough, the line survives the minute encroachment. On the other hand, if the gap is too thin, it can fill in or at least be compromised. This is why experienced designers don't use type with small serifs in reverse. The serifs fill in even with good printing. And why fonts in the Didone family such as Bodoni, Modern, Dido, etc. are so seldom used in identity design. They have some nice thick strokes, but they also have some very thin strokes that tend to disappear, especially when the type is reversed. And it gets worse when the type is smaller. This problem is not eliminated in the digital world. We view all digital media through a grid of pixels. Admittedly, the grids are getting finer as screen resolutions for electronic devices go up. Regardless, pixel mush reasserts itself. To review, pixel mush happens when shapes or lines are so small that they cannot be rendered with either a pixel in the solid identity color or solid background color. If the identity colors are black and white, edges will be anti-aliased, which means that gray pixels are used on the edge to disguise the pixel grid. Anti-aliasing gives us a smoother edge on elements on the screen and hides the jaggies. But this useful technological visual help is a double-edged sword. In a black logo with a white background, very thin white lines may be rendered only in gray because the lines aren't wide enough for any pixels to be completely white or black. Some of these logos were taken from magazines printed on glossy paper with reproduction as good as one can expect, and yet the logos have filled in. The fault is not in the printing, but in the designs. In a series of thin lines or gaps, lines can appear darker or lighter due to the number of pixels that make them up respectively. Even so, lines that should be uniform appear varied, and groups of lines which should be the same appear to get lighter and darker. You can't get away from it. Pixels are a fact of life, especially on the web. Lines or gaps too small always cause problems. Sooner or later, any identity will be used in reverse. So this principle applies to either positive or negative lines in any design. This is also why fonts with the fine lines are problematic for identities. The fine lines tend to suffer in positive and fill in reverse. One thing about branding design that is different from most other areas of design is that one never knows what sizes a brand might be used. An original design may look fine at 6 inches square, but may have problems at 1 inch square or even smaller. Fine reversed lines in a logo are subject to a similar fate. Of course, thin positive lines in a logo become thin negative lines when the logo is reversed. Of all of the 7 deadly sins, using elements too small or lines too thin perhaps is the most common, second only to designing a logo that fails to work in solid black. The too small, too thin sin is one of the few ever committed by the great identity designers such as Paul Rand, Saul Bass, Chermayeff Geismar, and Haviv. In virtually every case where they used tiny elements or thin lines, the identities have been replaced or amended. Rand and Bass even corrected this mistake in their own logos, IBM and AT&T respectively. Over years, countless designers for many companies have produced logos with lines that are too thin for good, solid reproduction. Most of these companies have redesigned their logos to correct this. They realize that you can't fight thin lines, you just have to get rid of them. A related problem happens when any line tapers gradually to a fine point. Whenever these lines are reversed, ink fill-in will cut off the tip of the point. This may be why Facebook Messenger's icon was recently changed to have two lines end with rounded points. Some designers try to hide from this reality by specifying that their design ought not be used below a certain size. Unfortunately, many times identities must be used smaller than the quote allowable end quote minimum. Companies often work with other companies where identities of all participants will be shown in a logo soup. The cost of newspaper ads and yellow page ads often encourage the use of smaller identities, but the coarser paper used in both of these further aggravates the effects of tiny elements and thin lines. Every brand you design should look clean and clear no matter if it is small or large, positive or reverse. This is why thin lines and tiny shapes are one of the deadly sins of logo design. For more information, go to logodesigntheory.com. If you found this useful, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and share this with anyone who needs to know about logo design.